Helen stood quietly at the grocery store checkout, her worn hands trembling as she counted out coins to pay for a few essentials and a box of cookies for her grandson Ethan. The cashier, Jake, glared at her with thinly veiled impatience, his sharp words cutting through the air like a cold wind. But just behind her, unnoticed by all, Keanu Reeves watched in silence, his calm presence a stark contrast to the growing tension. What happened next would leave everyone in the store speechless and change Helen's life in ways no one could predict. Before we get into this heartwarming story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you love inspiring tales like this, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow, we've got another unforgettable story waiting for you. Helen, a 72-year-old widow, stepped into the small suburban grocery store with her grandson Ethan by her side. The sun blazed outside, but inside the fluorescent lights cast a steady glow over the aisles. At her age, every trip to the store felt like a small battle, one she fought with quiet determination. Her hands, lined with years of hard work, gripped the handle of a worn basket. Beside her, Ethan, just 8 years old, walked with a bounce in his step, his wide eyes scanning the shelves. He didn't notice the weight his grandmother carried, not the basket, but the burden of keeping their little world together on a meager pension. 3 years had passed since Helen lost her daughter Anna in a sudden car accident. The memory still lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. Anna had been the heart of their family, a single mother who filled their modest home with laughter and love. When she was gone, Helen stepped in without hesitation, promising herself she'd raise Ethan the way Anna would have wanted. She didn't have much, just enough to cover rent, utilities, and the basics, but she made sure Ethan never felt the pinch. Every day she stretched those few dollars, hiding her worries behind a warm smile. To Ethan, she was simply Grandma, the woman who tucked him in at night and told him stories of his mother. Today was no different. They'd come to the store for necessities. A bag of rice, a carton of milk, a loaf of bread. Helen moved slowly down the aisles, her eyes flicking to price tags, calculating in her head. She'd learned to make do over the years, a skill honed through decades of raising Anna alone after her husband passed. Ethan, though, didn't see the numbers the way she did. To him, the store was a wonderland of possibilities. He pointed at cereals with bright cartoon characters and cans of soup stacked like towers, chattering about what he'd seen at school. Helen nodded, letting his excitement fill the silence she often kept. Then they reached the cookie aisle. Ethan stopped short, his small hand tugging at her sleeve. "Grandma, look," he said, his voice bright with recognition. He pointed to a box of chocolate chip cookies on the shelf, the kind wrapped in a familiar red package. "These are the ones Mom used to get me." His eyes sparkled, a grin spreading across his face. Helen froze, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't need to look at the box to know it. Those cookies had been Anna's treat for Ethan, a little ritual from happier days. Every Friday, Anna would come home from work, pull that red box from her bag, and watch Ethan's face light up as they shared a few over milk. It was a memory Helen clung to, one of the last threads tying them to Anna. She reached out, her fingers brushing the package. The price tag stared back at her, $2.99. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tip her careful budget over the edge. She'd already counted the coins in her purse that morning. Every penny accounted for. There wasn't room for extras, not this week. But then she looked at Ethan. His smile, so much like Anna's, held a quiet hope. He didn't ask for much, never had. He didn't know how tight things were, how Helen skipped her own meals some days to make sure he had enough. To him, those cookies weren't just a snack, they were a piece of his mother, a taste of the past he could still hold on to. Helen's chest tightened. She could hear Anna's voice in her mind, soft and insistent. "Mom, let him have it. He deserves to smile." It was the same voice that had urged her through every tough choice since the accident. She'd made a promise to Anna to give Ethan the childhood he deserved, no matter the cost to herself. Saying no to him now felt like breaking that promise. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted the box from the shelf. "Okay, sweetheart," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "We'll get them." Ethan beamed, clutching her hand tighter. "Thanks, Grandma. You're the best." He didn't see the flicker of worry in her eyes, or the way she pressed her lips together, already recalculating how she'd make it work. She placed the cookies in the basket beside the rice and milk, the small indulgence feeling heavier than it should. It was a choice she'd made 100 times before, putting him first, always. He'd figure out the rest later, like she always did. As they headed toward the checkout, Helen's mind churned. The coins in her purse jangled faintly, a sound she'd grown used to. She'd counted them twice that morning, $12.47. The essentials would take most of it, and the cookies might leave her short. She could skip the milk, maybe, or stretch the rice a little longer. She'd done it before. But Ethan's hand in hers, warm and trusting, kept her moving forward. For him, she'd find a way. She always had. What she didn't know, what neither of them could have guessed, was that this ordinary trip to the store was about to become something extraordinary. Behind them, unnoticed in the growing line, a man in a black jacket watched quietly, his steady gaze taking in every moment. And what he'd do next would turn Helen's small act of love into a story she'd never forget. Helen approached the checkout counter with Ethan close behind, her basket feeling heavier with each step. The line was long, a restless shuffle of customers waiting to pay. She set the basket down, carefully, rice, milk, bread, and that box of chocolate chip cookies Ethan had picked out. The cashier, Jake, a wiry man in his 40s with a permanent scowl, barely glanced at her as he scanned the items. His fingers tapped impatiently on the counter, a rhythm that matched the growing unease in Helen's chest. She reached into her purse, pulling out a small cloth pouch of coins, and began to count them out one by one. Her hands moved slowly, not because she couldn't count, but because she needed to be sure. Every penny mattered. She'd done this 100 times before, stretching her pension to cover the basics, making it work somehow. But today, with the cookies added, the numbers felt tighter than usual. She murmured to herself, 10, 11, 12, as the coins clinked softly onto the counter. Ethan stood beside her, holding the cookie box with both hands, his eyes bright with anticipation. He didn't see the tension building. To him, this was just another trip with Grandma. Jake let out an exaggerated sigh, loud enough to turn heads. "Seriously, lady," he said, crossing his arms, "this isn't a bank, you know. We don't have all day for you to play accountant." His voice carried a sharp edge, cutting through the hum of the store. Helen flinched, her fingers pausing over a dime. She kept her head down, focusing on the coins, but her cheeks burned with embarrassment. She wasn't used to this, being called out in front of strangers. She had always prided herself on keeping things together, even when life got hard. "I'm sorry," she whispered, barely audible, resuming her count. 13, 14. But Jake wasn't done. He leaned forward, his tone dripping with mockery. "You're holding up the line, Grandma. Don't waste everyone's time if you can't afford to shop like normal people." The words stung, each one a jab at the dignity she'd fought to hold on to since Anna's death. She glanced at Ethan, hoping he hadn't heard, but his small brow furrowed as he looked up at her. "Grandma's not wasting time," Ethan piped up, his voice high and earnest. He stepped closer to Helen, clutching the cookies tighter. "She's just paying. Leave her alone." His innocence only seemed to fuel Jake's irritation. The cashier rolled his eyes, letting out a harsh laugh. "Oh, great, now the kid's gonna lecture me too? Listen, brat, if she can't pay, that's not my problem." He pointed a finger at Ethan, his smirk widening. "Maybe you should tell her to stop grabbing stuff she can't afford." Helen's heart sank. She reached for Ethan's shoulder, pulling him back gently. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to stay calm. But it wasn't okay. The weight of Jake's words pressed down on her, stirring a shame she hadn't felt in years. She'd faced tough times before, nights with no heat, days with no food, but she'd always shielded Ethan from it. Now, here in this crowded store, that shield was cracking. Jake wasn't finished. He grabbed the cookie box from the counter where Ethan had set it, holding it up like evidence. "What's this? Cookies? If you don't have the cash, don't even dream of taking these." With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the box aside. It landed with a dull thud on a pile of returns, out of reach. Ethan's face fell, his small hands balling into fists. "Hey, those are mine!" he cried, his voice cracking with hurt. Helen felt her throat tighten, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She wanted to say something, to defend him, but the words wouldn't come. Behind them, the line stirred. A man in a suit muttered, "Some people shouldn't bother coming out if they can't pay." A woman with a cart full of groceries chuckled under her breath, shaking her head. Others just stared, their impatience palpable. Helen's hands shook as she tried to keep counting. 15, 16, but the coins slipped through her fingers, clattering onto the counter. She was short, she knew it now. The total was $13.25, and she had only $12.47. The cookies had pushed her over just as she'd feared. I'll put the cookies back," she said softly, her voice breaking. She couldn't look at Jake, couldn't face the judgment in his eyes. She turned to Ethan, forcing a smile. "We don't need them today, honey, it's fine." But Ethan's lip quivered, and he shook his head. "No, Grandma, you said we could. They're Mom's cookies." His words hit her like a punch. He was right. They weren't just cookies. They were a piece of Anna, a small joy she'd wanted to give him. And now, she couldn't even do that. Jake snorted, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, well, Mom's cookies aren't free, kid. Maybe next time come prepared." He waved a hand at the growing line. "Thanks for the hold-up, folks. Guess not everyone knows how to shop." A few muffled laughs echoed from the crowd, each one twisting the knife deeper into Helen's chest. She gathered the coins with shaking hands, ready to abandon the whole purchase if she had to. She just wanted to leave, to escape the eyes boring into her back. Ethan tugged at her sleeve, his voice small but fierce. "Don't listen to him, Grandma. You're not bad." She nodded, blinking back tears, but the shame was overwhelming. She'd failed him, not just today, but in every way that mattered. She couldn't even give him this one small thing. As she fumbled with the coins, she didn't notice the tall figure in a black jacket stepping closer from the line, his steady gaze fixed on the scene unfolding. What he was about to do would turn this moment of humiliation into something none of them could have expected. Helen stood frozen at the checkout, her trembling hands clutching the scattered coins as Jake's mocking words echoed in her ears. Ethan clung to her side, his small face flushed with frustration, still glaring at the cashier who'd tossed their cookies aside. The line behind them buzzed with impatience, murmurs, sighs, and the occasional snicker piling onto Helen's shame. She just wanted to disappear, to take Ethan and slip out of the store before the tears she was holding back broke. But then, a shadow moved forward from the crowd, and everything changed. A tall man in a black jacket stepped up to the counter, his presence quiet but impossible to ignore. He'd been standing a few spots back in line, unnoticed until now, his dark eyes fixed on the scene with a steady intensity. It was Keanu Reeves. Though no one recognized him yet under the simple hoodie and sunglasses perched on his head, his voice cut through the tension, low and firm, like a rumble of distant thunder. "Who do you think you are, talking to them like that?" he said, directing the words straight at Jake. Jake blinked, caught off guard, his smirk faltering for a split second. He recovered quickly, leaning forward with a sneer. "And who are you? Some wannabe hero sticking his nose where it doesn't belong?" He waved a hand dismissively, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Mind your own business, pal. I'm just doing my job. Unlike some people who can't even pay." The jab was aimed at Helen, but his eyes stayed locked on Keanu, challenging him to back off. Helen glanced up, startled by the stranger's intervention. She didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to shrink away, to avoid more attention, but another part felt a flicker of relief that someone had spoken up. Ethan peeked out from behind her, his curiosity piqued. Keanu didn't flinch. He took a step closer, his voice still calm but edged with steel. "Your job doesn't give you the right to humiliate anyone. She's paying what she has, same as everyone else here. What's your excuse?" The air grew thick with tension. Jake's face reddened, his patience unraveling. "Oh, spare me the lecture," he snapped, slamming a hand on the counter. "You think you're better than me? I've got a line of people waiting because she can't get it together. If you're so noble, why don't you pay for her yourself?" It was meant as a taunt, a throwaway line to shut the stranger down, but Keanu tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at his lip. "Fine," he said simply. "I will." Jake froze, his mouth half open. Helen's breath caught, her coins slipping from her fingers to clatter onto the counter. "No, please," she stammered, shaking her head. "You don't have to." "I can manage." Her pride battled with her exhaustion, but Keanu raised a hand gently, his expression softening as he looked at her. "You've managed enough," he said. "Let me help." Before she could protest further, Jake cut in, his voice rising. "What is this, a charity show? You're not turning my checkout into a circus." The argument escalated fast. Jake jabbed a finger at Keanu, his temper flaring. "You want to play Good Samaritan? Take it somewhere else. I'm not here for your games." He reached for the intercom button on his register, his eyes narrowing. "Security, get this guy out of here. He's disrupting everything." A ripple of unease spread through the line. Some customers shifted uncomfortably. Others craned their necks to watch. Helen pulled Ethan closer, her heart pounding. She didn't want this, didn't want a scene, didn't want anyone fighting over her. Keanu didn't budge. He crossed his arms, his calm unshaken, even as Jake's voice boomed through the store. "Disrupting?" he said, his tone sharp now. "You're the one making this harder than it needs to be. She's a grandmother trying to buy groceries for her kid and you're treating her like trash. Maybe you should rethink who's the problem here." The words hit like a punch, and Jake's bravado cracked. He opened his mouth to retort, but a security guard, a stocky man in a gray uniform, pushed through the crowd, eyeing Keanu warily. "Sir, you need to step back," the guard said, his hand hovering near his radio. For a moment, it seemed like things might spiral out of control. The guard squared his shoulders, Jake smirked triumphantly, and Helen whispered to Ethan, "We should go." But then Keanu reached up slowly and pulled off his sunglasses, revealing a face that silenced the entire store. Whispers erupted instantly. "Wait, is that? No way, it's him. Keanu Reeves?" Jake's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. The guard hesitated, his hand dropping from the radio. Keanu ignored the growing buzz, his focus still on Jake. "Yeah, it's me," he said, his voice steady. "And I'm not going anywhere until this is right." He turned to Helen, his gaze warm and reassuring. "I'm covering your groceries, all of them, and we're not done yet." He glanced at Ethan, who stared up at him wide-eyed, then back at Jake. "Ring it up, and while you're at it, add whatever they need. I don't care what you think about it." Jake sputtered, his defiance crumbling under the weight of Keanu's presence. You can't just," he started, but Keanu cut him off. "I can, and I am." He stepped past the counter, motioning to Helen and Ethan. "Come with me. Let's get what you really need, not just what you can scrape by with." Helen hesitated, overwhelmed, but Ethan tugged her hand, his excitement breaking through her doubt. "Grandma, he's helping us, please!" The crowd parted as Keanu led them back toward the aisles, leaving Jake dumbfounded at the register. The security guard shrugged and stepped aside, muttering, "Guess that's that." Customers pulled out phones, snapping pictures, their whispers turning to chatter. Jake slumped in his chair, his earlier arrogance replaced by a mix of shock and resentment. He'd lost control of the situation, and to Keanu Reeves, no less. Helen followed Keanu, her mind reeling. She didn't know why this stranger, this famous stranger, had stepped in, but something in his quiet resolve made her trust him. Ethan skipped beside her, already pointing at the shelves. "Can we get more cookies?" he asked, and Keanu chuckled, a sound that eased the knot in Helen's chest. "As many as you want," he said, "and anything else you've been missing." What had started as a moment of humiliation was turning into something else entirely, something Helen couldn't yet grasp. Jake's challenge had backfired, and Keanu's unexpected kindness was about to rewrite the day in ways no one in that store could have predicted. Keanu led Helen and Ethan away from the checkout, his stride steady and purposeful as they moved back into the aisles. The hum of the grocery store followed them, whispers, footsteps, and the occasional beep of a scanner. But Keanu's calm presence seemed to carve a quiet space around them. He grabbed an empty cart and handed it to Ethan with a small smile. "Let's fill this up," he said. "Anything you need, food, toys, whatever. Don't hold back." Ethan's eyes lit up, and he darted toward the shelves, already pointing at a box of cereal with a cartoon dinosaur on it. "Grandma, can we get this?" Helen trailed behind, her steps hesitant. She clutched her purse, the weight of the coins inside a reminder of her limits. Keanu's offer was generous, too generous, and it stirred a knot of unease in her chest. She'd spent decades fending for herself, raising Anna alone, making ends meet through sheer will. Accepting help felt like admitting defeat, like she couldn't provide for Ethan the way she'd promised her daughter. "No, thank you," she said quietly, her voice firm despite the tremor in it. "We don't need all this. You've done enough." Keanu stopped, turning to face her. His dark eyes softened, but there was a resolve in them she couldn't miss. "Helen, right?" he said, glancing at the name stitched on her old sweater, a gift from Anna years ago. She nodded, surprised he'd noticed. "I'm not doing this because I think you can't manage," he continued. "You've been strong for him, I can see that. But sometimes strength is letting someone else carry a little of the load. This isn't pity, it's what's right." Helen's lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to believe him, but pride was a stubborn thing. "I've gotten by just fine," she said, her tone sharper than she meant. "I don't want Ethan thinking we're a charity case." Ethan paused mid-reach for a toy truck, looking back at her with wide eyes. Keanu crouched to his level, keeping his voice low so only they could hear. "He won't think that. He'll think his grandma's loved by him, by me, by everyone who sees what you've done for him. Let him have this." The words hit her hard, cracking the wall she'd built around herself. She looked at Ethan, his small hand hovering over the truck, waiting for her okay. Anna's voice echoed in her mind again. "Let him have it, Mom." Helen swallowed, her resolve wavering. "All right," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "But just a few things." Keanu smiled. A real, warm smile, and stood up. "A few things it is," he agreed, though his tone suggested he had no intention of stopping there. They moved through the aisles together. Ethan picked out cereal, a bag of apples, and the toy truck, his excitement growing with each item. Keanu added more: milk, bread, a jar of peanut butter, even a warm blanket he spotted on a discount rack. "Winter's coming," he said, when Helen raised an eyebrow. She didn't argue this time, but she watched the cart filled with a mix of gratitude and guilt. Every item felt like a gift she couldn't repay, and that gnawed at her. Back at the checkout, trouble was brewing. Jake hadn't let the incident go. He'd slipped away from his register, muttering to a group of customers near the coffee aisle. "She's playing the poor old lady card," he said, loud enough for his voice to carry. "That guy's just a sucker falling for it. Probably does this all the time, cries a little, gets free stuff." A few people nodded, their skepticism fueled by Jake's bitterness. An older man with a cane scoffed. "Some folks'll do anything for a handout." A woman in a bright scarf added, "Yeah, I bet she planned this." The rumors spread fast, a ripple of judgment threading through the store. By the time Helen, Ethan, and Keanu returned to the front, the mood had shifted. Eyes followed them, some curious, some hostile. Helen caught a snippet of the whispers and froze, her face paling. "They think I'm a beggar," she murmured, her hands tightening on the cart. Ethan overheard too, his small fists clenching. "That's not true," he shouted, his voice piercing the air. "Grandma's not a liar, you're all mean." His outburst drew more attention. The man with the cane stepped forward, pointing at Helen. "Kid's got a mouth, huh? Maybe teach him some manners instead of scamming people." The woman with the scarf laughed, egging Jake on. "See? They're trouble, should have kicked him out." Jake crossed his arms, smirking from the sidelines, clearly pleased with the chaos he'd stirred. The store felt like a pressure cooker, ready to blow. Helen's shoulders slumped. The brief warmth from Keanu's kindness, drowned by the weight of accusation. "We should go," she said, tugging Ethan's hand. "I don't want this." But Keanu stepped in front of the cart, blocking their path. He turned to the crowd, his voice steady but commanding. "Enough," he said, loud enough to silence the murmurs. "You don't know her story. She's not here for handouts. She's here for—" He nodded at Ethan, who glared defiantly at the onlookers. "If you've got a problem with that, take it up with me." The man with the cane hesitated, then muttered, "Whatever," and shuffled off. The woman in the scarf rolled her eyes but backed away. Jake, though, wasn't ready to let it drop. "You think you're some big shot, huh?" he sneered. "Doesn't change what she is." Keanu fixed him with a look that could have stopped traffic. "What she is," he said, "is someone who's kept going when most would have given up. You could learn something from her." The crowd quieted, some nodding thoughtfully, others looking away. Keanu turned back to Helen, his expression softening. "We're finishing this," he said. "No one's taking this from you. Not him, not them." He pushed the cart toward a different register, where a younger cashier watched with wide eyes. Helen followed, her heart pounding, torn between gratitude and the sting of those judging stares. Ethan stuck close, his small hand in hers, whispering, "He's right, Grandma. You're the best." As the new cashier began scanning their items, the tension lingered, but Keanu's resolve held it at bay. What he'd started wasn't just about groceries. It was about giving Helen and Ethan something more, something no rumor could touch. And he wasn't done yet. The new cashier scanned the last of Helen and Ethan's items, a cart now brimming with groceries, a toy truck, and that precious box of chocolate chip cookies. Keanu stood by, hands in his pockets, watching with a quiet satisfaction as the total ticked up on the screen. Helen still felt the sting of the crowd's earlier judgment, but the weight of it was lifting, replaced by a cautious gratitude. Ethan beamed, clutching his truck, already chattering about how he'd play with it at home. For a moment, it seemed like the worst was over, like kindness had won the day. But trouble wasn't done with them yet. Jake stormed back into the scene, his face twisted with a smug determination. He held up a crumpled receipt, waving it like a flag of victory. "Hold it right there," he barked, loud enough to halt the cashier mid-scan. "This whole thing's a scam. They're trying to walk out with free stuff. Check the numbers. It doesn't add up." He thrust the paper at the manager, a balding man in a wrinkled tie who'd just arrived. Drawn by the commotion, "I knew it. Her and this guy cooked it up together." Helen's stomach dropped. She stared at the receipt, her mind racing. "That's not true," she said, her voice shaking. "We didn't—" But Jake cut her off, jabbing a finger at Keanu. "Oh, please. You think I'm stupid? Big shot here swoops in and suddenly she's got a full cart? It's a con. I've seen it before." The manager frowned, peering at the receipt, then at the register. "This is irregular," he muttered, scratching his head. "We'll need to check this out." A small investigation unfolded right there at the counter. The manager called over another employee to compare receipts, while customers lingered, whispering among themselves. Helen's hands trembled as she gripped Ethan's shoulder. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said, her voice cracking. "I just wanted to pay and go." She turned to Keanu, panic in her eyes. "They'll think you're part of some trick. I'm so sorry." Keanu's jaw tightened, but he stayed calm, his gaze flicking to Jake. "Don't worry," he said softly. "This isn't on you." Jake smirked, crossing his arms as the manager puzzled over the numbers. "Told you," he said to the crowd, "caught them red-handed." But then Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "Before you decide anything," he said, his tone even, "you might want to see this." He tapped the screen and handed it to the manager. A video played, grainy but clear, showing Jake slipping behind the register earlier, tampering with a receipt printer, muttering about making them pay. The audio caught his spiteful rant. "They'll regret crossing me. I'll fix this place good." The manager's eyes widened. "What the hell?" he said, turning to Jake. "You did this?" Jake's smirk vanished, his face paling. That's not what it looks like," he stammered, but the evidence was undeniable. Keanu spoke up, his voice steady. "He's not just a bad cashier, he's got a grudge. I heard him talking about getting back at this store. Figured I'd record it, just in case." The twist hit like a thunderclap. Jake wasn't some annoyed employee. He'd been fired months ago for theft, and had snuck back, posing as staff to stir chaos and pin it on others. Security swarmed in, this time for Jake. Handcuffs clicked as he protested, dragged out shouting, "You can't prove anything," but the proof was already in the manager's hands. The crowd buzzed, stunned by the turnabout. The manager approached Helen, apologetic. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. This shouldn't have happened. Your groceries are on us and will cover any trouble this caused." He handed her a gift card, a small gesture of amends. Helen nodded, too overwhelmed to argue. Keanu stepped back as the scene settled, brushing off the manager's thanks. "Just make sure it doesn't happen again," he said, then turned to Helen and Ethan. "You're set now. Take care of each other." Ethan grinned, holding up his truck. "Thanks, mister. You're awesome." Helen managed a shaky smile. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. Keanu shrugged, his humility genuine. "You don't have to. Keep being a great grandma. That's enough." He slipped out quietly, fading into the parking lot as the story spread through the store. Helen and Ethan went home with more than groceries that day. They carried a renewed faith in kindness, a belief that even in tough times, good could prevail. Word of Keanu's actions trickled online, a viral spark of inspiration, but no one knew the full truth. He'd already contacted a local charity setting up a scholarship for Ethan's future, a silent gift to ensure Anna's son would thrive. Helen never learned of it, but as she watched Ethan play that night, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. A quiet hope that life still held surprises worth believing in. As Helen found peace that night, this story left us with a powerful lesson. Kindness doesn't need a spotlight. It thrives in quiet acts that lift others up. In life, we'll face judgment and setbacks, but one small gesture can rewrite someone's day, even their future. Be the person who steps in, not the one who looks away. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Your support keeps these stories alive. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what's one kind act you've seen lately? Subscribe for more tales of hope tomorrow.